I can tell you from all the politicians that I've ever engaged, that you're engaging a person who has prejudices which preclude representing the people. Because in just what you just said just now, that politician, which is like all politicians likely, has advocated you pay a debt which you can no more agree exists than in this example of this game that we've just explained. And I really explained this very well in several of the first TNS radio archives that I sent you the link to. I explained this nature of the promissory obligation in the first program quite thoroughly. And when people understand this, they're changed forever because they suddenly realize how shallow this lie is of this obfuscation of the currency which has been imposed upon every country in the world. So this politician is not intending to serve you. He is denying you representation because they wouldn't even put it in the terms that they just did if they were after representation. They would say, no, Thor, you sent me a link to this paper, or you sent me this email from this fellow, Mike Montagne, which elaborates on exposes the actual nature and obligations of a promissory obligation, in which you can clearly see by examining every step and class of steps, the banks never, ever, 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 ever once give up lawful consideration. And yet this lie exists that there's a debt to the banks. In no way in the world does such a debt exist. Now, on the other hand, Thor, and for all of you there, so that we can understand how we would solve this as a people, in this country, according to our Constitution, no private entity can be given any powers or rights which are not granted equally and in common to all other private people and entities. Therefore, if by imposing this obfuscation of the promissory obligation upon us, this what we call a bank issues an irredeemable promise to pay as evidence of a debt to itself, which debt cannot exist because no lawful consideration was ever given up. But yet if this politician contends, or this bank contends, that such a debt exists nonetheless, why and how is it not equally right that in repayment of that debt, or more properly resolution of the lie of that debt, we likewise issue a like irredeemable promise to pay in complete repayment and or legal challenge of this obfuscation in a court of law which represents the interests of the people? Why is it not equally lawful that we pay the debt off with an equal like issuance of an irredeemable promise to pay? The bank makes no provision whatsoever to redeem this currency in anything of value that it gives up.
Well, I don't think we have a as good constitution here in Iceland, but
nevertheless, this is a violation of human rights, which people all over the world recognize as a violation of human rights. And in this country, and I don't mean to imply that I think the United States is above any other country. I absolutely do not. In fact, we've lowered ourselves to the bottom of the heap, in recent history. But nevertheless, the principle upon which this country was founded was not that we allowed any lack of prior existence of law preclude doing what was just. Instead, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he assailed the violations of human rights by the monarchy in England in the Declaration of Independence as crimes against the people, regardless of whether or not the monarch monarchy grants itself the legal authority to do these things as common acts. We said no. These are crimes, and of course it is a crime. We're denied the ability to do this to each other because if we could compete with the banks couldn't be a dominant factor in doing this. And likewise, if we did charge interest to each other, it would all cancel out. There would be no benefit of it whatsoever. Whatever I charge in interest is what I'm going to be paying in interest. So there would be no purpose of it. Moreover, the obfuscation of the currency is such that it denies every real creditor interest. You're paying the interest to mere publishers of evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. You see, so the whole thing is a lie. It can't be just, and there cannot be any legal argument regardless of the absence of law, or regardless, as in the case of the United States, where we have this so-called Federal Reserve Act illegally foisted upon the people in violation of the 1912 party platform of the Democrats, who were elected to power, promising not to create a central bank. You see, this was all accomplished by deceit and breach of promise, by blatant betrayal. And so the lack of law, you might consider it a deterrent, but what happens is the next thing you know, you're 60 and you wanted to do this, and because you realize that if you didn't stand up for what's right, regardless of the law, you never could have gotten it, and that's why you don't have it 40 years down the road, like I don't have it 40 years down the road. Now, I was willing to challenge the law from the beginning, but as you were also realizing, other people not wanting to understand these difficult matters, purportedly unable, although I believe all people are able, to understand the nature of the crime that's being committed against them. So they don't side with the only thing that can serve them. And so we are largely most destructive to ourselves. In truth, as we were discussing before, Reykjavik is such a predominant proportion of the population in Iceland that, in truth, the city of Reykjavik could adopt its own constitution, create its own money, and effectively rescue the country from these bankers. To put it simply and bluntly to you, this is not a matter of personal opinion, and it is certainly not even a radical response as it can easily be interpreted to be. Are you still there? I'm getting some electrical interference here. It's not a radical response. It only can be thought to be one when we don't understand how these banks are stealing from us and multiplying artificial indebtedness into terminal indebtedness. Now, to translate what this politician has replied to you, it translates to, well, listen, you can want as much as you want to change things. I'm going to say this in a really polite way where you can't even detect that I'm against you. But thing is, we're going to honor these debts. We're not even going to evaluate whether or not there was ever any lawful consideration given up by these banks. What a preposterous lie this is that launders the principal into their possession. But worse, by interest, unwarranted interest, which cannot be justified by the dollar that it cost to put $100,000 into circulation, to multiply into $400,000 worth of debt. Since we cannot justify interest, therefore, we're even going to ask you to suffer terminal indebtedness, which is your present circumstance, which has caused the failure of this bank. It isn't just that the bank owned bad debts, quote unquote. It isn't just that. It's that the banking system itself multiplies all debts into bad debts because it makes a sum of debt, which eventually makes it impossible to service the debts, at which failure, of course, all of the proprietorship of property reverts to the banks for merely issuing evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. So, you see, when I approach a politician, I don't ask the question that you did. I explain this obfuscation to them, and they're already running for cover. They're knowing they're wrong, that I'm absolutely right, and that they have no argument against me. They will not offer me the answer that was given you because they know I see right through them. So they run and they run and they run and they run. But that's getting at the answer that you eventually need to know, because these people refuse to serve the people. They are acting as much as agents of the banking system, however unjustified it is and however terminal its consequences. And we have to understand one thing about banking. In order to persist, in order for this lie to persist, it has to spend vast amounts of its vast unearned takings from us in order to usurp government for the explicit purpose of denying us representation. The founding fathers of this country anticipated that long ago, although they never came up with a monetary solution. Some of them got close. Jefferson, Lincoln got close. Franklin thought about the issues, but didn't resolve them and to the questions they needed to be in order to come up with the answers. These issues have plagued modern humanity for hundreds of years, and it's inexcusable, I think, that we can't recognize solution. There's no compromising of the principles, which is solution, and by understanding this obfuscation of the currency and its ramifications, we can understand what every other ramification is. In other words, just as I explained the ramifications of Glass-Steagall, am I just suddenly coming up with this answer? Absolutely not. Realized that over 40 years ago. Why? Because you're preserving banking. What is the ramifications of banking? Can we say that there's one class of banks and another class of banks, and somehow by dividing them into classes and passing certain laws against one class or the other or both classes, which ostensibly prevent the ramifications of their obfuscation of the currency, but cannot, because as long as you preserve the obfuscation, it produces the consequences, you've basically nullified everything that you've intended to do, and you're only pretending that you could accomplish this by such a thing. You see, there's no proof that it even has a means of accomplishing it. And how do we understand this? By simply understanding the obfuscation of the currency. That this kind of money, so-called money of the banks, inherently and irreversibly multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to capacity to pay. So, the inevitable outcome is terminal and soluble indebtedness. Unless you want to challenge this obfuscation, which claims such a debt exists, you can get nowhere. And so this politician, if he's one of the people, would welcome the opportunity to be in the room with you now and to engage in a debate of this obfuscation. How is it designed, for instance, to serve the people? When you think about it, that idea is preposterous. If government determines to build a bridge across a river, well, it's obvious that, you have to have engineers that build a bridge that withstand the traffic that it's going to be subjected to. Okay, well, why would that principle not apply to economy? What role should the banks have in exploiting the currency at all? What are the costs the banks endure? Why